How medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts. This is how a medieval monk turned a dead calf into one of the most expensive objects in the medieval world, a process that took years, cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and produced books that are still intact and readable 700 years later. This is the complete story of how illuminated manuscripts were made, from the animal skin to the gold leaf to the locked chest in the library. The illuminated manuscript was the most labor-intensive and materially costly object regularly produced in the medieval world. A complete Bible, more than 1,200 folios in most versions, took a skilled scribe between 1 and 3 years to copy. Labor accounted for approximately 3/4 of the total production cost. The materials made up the rest, and some of those materials were among the most expensive commodities available in medieval Europe. Before a single word could be written, the writing surface had to be made. Monks soaked animal hides in water, usually sheep or calf, and left them for several days until the hair and flesh could be scraped away. The scraped skin was stretched on a wooden frame under tension, allowed to dry while still stretched, and then scraped again with a sharp curved blade called a lunellum, which removed remaining impurities and thinned the surface to a consistent thickness. Lime bleached the skin white. The result, after several weeks of this process, was parchment made from sheep or vellum made from calf. Vellum being finer, smoother, and more expensive, the material of choice for the highest quality books. A single large Bible required the processed hides of approximately 500 animals. The monastery maintained herds precisely to supply this demand, and the slaughter, soaking, stretching, and scraping of that many skins was itself a significant industrial operation, occupying dedicated monks and lay brothers for extended periods whenever a major manuscript project was underway. Once the parchment was prepared and cut to size, the scribe could begin laying out the page. This was done with a ruling tool, a pointed instrument that pressed indentations into the surface, creating guidelines for the text without leaving visible marks. Margins were calculated, column widths were set, space was allocated for the large decorative initials and illuminated miniatures that would be added later by a different specialist. The text itself was written with a quill cut from a large feather, typically goose or swan, trimmed to a sharp nib, and reworked regularly as it wore down. Scribes worked only in daylight and were forbidden from bringing candles or lamps near the manuscripts, because fire was the single greatest threat to a manuscript collection, and because the quality of artificial light made precision work difficult. A supervisor, the director of the Scriptorium, circulated through the room ensuring that monks kept to their assigned pages, maintained silence, and did not deviate from the text they were copying. The ink most commonly used was iron gall ink, produced from oak galls, the round woody growths found on oak trees where wasps have laid their eggs, crushed and soaked in water with iron sulfate and a binding agent like gum arabic. Oak gall produced a dark, durable ink that adhered well to vellum. It was, however, corrosive over time, a detail with consequences for the manuscripts themselves, which is addressed in a separate video. With the text complete, the page went to the illuminator. The word illuminated came from the use of gold and silver, whose reflective surfaces literally lit up the page when held in candlelight or brought to a window. Gold leaf, hammered to near translucent thinness and applied over a sticky base called gesso, was the defining feature of the most valuable manuscripts. The gesso was laid down first in the shape of the design, allowed to set, and then the gold leaf was pressed onto it and burnished smooth with a hard polishing tool, often made from a tooth or a smooth stone. The gold caught and threw back light in a way that no paint could replicate. Silver was used less often, partly because it tarnished over time in ways gold did not, which meant silver illumination could darken and lose its reflective quality within generations. The color pigments used alongside gold were sourced from across the known world and represented a significant portion of manuscript production costs. Ultramarine blue came from lapis lazuli mined exclusively in Afghanistan during the medieval period, transported overland and by sea to Western Europe, hence its name from the Latin for beyond the sea. Lapis lazuli was the second most expensive raw material in manuscript production after gold. Grinding the stone and processing it into usable pigment was itself a complex operation requiring multiple washes and filtrations to separate the blue from the gray and white minerals mixed with it in the raw stone. Vermilion red came from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, which could be mined directly or produced by heating mercury with sulfur. It was expensive, second in cost among the reds only to gold leaf itself. Lead white provided the base for highlights and was mixed with other pigments to lighten them. Verdigris, a copper-derived green, was both a pigment and a corrosive agent that could eat through parchment over centuries. Red lead, known as minium, was cheaper than vermilion and widely used for the red lettering and rubrication that marked headings, chapter breaks, and important passages throughout medieval manuscripts. Research published in 2019 detected ultramarine pigment in the dental calculus of a woman buried at a German medieval monastery, suggesting that female scribes and illuminators were active in manuscript production. A reminder that the surviving record tells us more about what was written than about who was writing it. Complex decorative designs were worked out on wax tablets before being transferred to the parchment. The wax tablet was the medieval scratch pad, cheap, reusable, and ideal for planning designs that would later be executed in irreplaceable gold and pigment. Once the design was settled, it was traced or drawn directly onto the vellum in a preliminary sketch, then built up layer by layer in paint, with the most expensive pigments typically applied last. The binding brought the finished pages together. Folded sheets were sewn in gatherings, the gatherings sewn to each other, and the assembled text block laced between covers of wood, typically oak or beech boards covered in leather. Metal clasps or leather ties held the book shut because parchment responds to humidity by expanding and contracting, and a closed book kept flat under the pressure of its clasps held its shape better than one allowed to open freely. The completed manuscript was then cataloged in the library, stored in a locked chest or on shelving, and loaned only under specific conditions with the librarian's oversight. From the 5th to the 13th centuries, monasteries were the primary producers of books in Western Europe. By the 14th century, commercial urban scriptoria in cities like Paris, Rome, and the Netherlands had absorbed much of the market for standard religious texts. But major monasteries continued producing manuscripts in-house, particularly for liturgical use and institutional record-keeping. The artistic quality of the highest medieval illuminated manuscripts, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Winchester Bible, represents a standard of craft that required years of training, access to expensive materials, and an institutional patience that only a monastic community with its long time horizons and accumulated expertise could sustain. What survives in museum collections today is a small fraction of what was made. The dissolution of English monasteries between 1536 and 1541 scattered and destroyed enormous numbers of books. What remains does so because some were hidden, some were purchased, and some were simply too beautiful for even the most aggressive Tudor administrator to destroy. To make how medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts feel real, imagine the monastery before sunrise, when the walls are dark, the yard is cold, and the community is already moving according to rules older than any living brother. The point of this world was not comfort, it was continuity. Every corridor, office, object, and gesture existed because someone before them had decided that prayer could only survive if it was protected by habit, labor, discipline, and money. The first thing a visitor would notice was how organized the place felt. The scriptorium led toward the library cupboard, while the parchment workshop connected the spiritual center to the working heart of the house. Nothing was placed at random. Even when buildings had grown unevenly over centuries, the monastery still tried to behave like a map of Christian order. with the church at the center and practical service spaces arranged around it like organs around a body. That order depended on people with sharply different duties. Scribes carried authority, but illuminators and librarians often made the daily machinery work. Novice copyists handled tasks that choir monks might barely see, and bookbinders revealed how closely the monastery was tied to the outside world. Medieval monastic life was communal, but it was never socially flat, rank-shaped where a person stood, ate, slept, spoke, and was remembered after death. The material world mattered because it made obedience visible. Quills could represent discipline as clearly as a sermon. Oak, gall, ink carried memory. Pumice stones protected property and boundaries. Vellum sheets served the body, while pigment shells reminded every monk that holiness was supposed to be practiced through ordinary things. A monastery was not an escape from material life. It was material life arranged to point toward eternity. The 14th century made that arrangement harder to maintain. Bad harvests, war taxation, changing labor markets, and epidemic disease all pressed against religious houses that had once seemed almost permanent. Some monasteries became poorer, others became more bureaucratic and defensive. Many tried to preserve ancient customs while quietly adapting to a world in which rents, wages, mortality, and local resentment no longer behaved the way earlier generations had expected. This is why monastic books and manuscript culture cannot be understood as a single custom or curiosity. It touched the monastery's schedule, its finances, its architecture, and its reputation. A decision made in the chapter house could change what happened in the kitchen. A shortage in the grange could affect the refectory. A dispute at the gate could become a legal entry in an account roll. Inside the walls, spiritual life and administration constantly leaned on each other. The documentary evidence is fragmentary, but it is not silent. Surviving manuscripts show how officials counted, corrected, and justified decisions. Colophons preserve the language of obligation. Library catalogs let historians reconstruct spaces that have lost their roofs, screens, and painted surfaces. Pigment analysis reveal the small details that grand narratives often miss. The result is a world that can be studied through stone, ink, bone, soil, and habit. A normal day brought the subject down from theory into tired bodies. Bells interrupted sleep. Cold floors met bare or sandaled feet. Voices rose in chant before breakfast. Hands lifted tools, books, bowls, keys, or spades. The same brother might pray with intense devotion in one hour and argue over supplies in another. Medieval monks were not symbols moving through a perfect religious machine. They were human beings trying to live inside one. The emotional tone of that life was quieter than modern imagination often allows. Devotion did not always look like ecstasy. Fear did not always look like panic. Authority did not always shout. A bowed head, a careful hand, a delayed answer, or a tired walk through the cloister could carry the whole weight of the institution. The monastery trained people to control their expressions, but it could not remove exhaustion, ambition, irritation, grief, or hope. The surrounding village understood the monastery in practical terms. It was a landlord, employer, lender, customer, court, school, hospital, granary, and sacred destination. Some locals depended on it for alms or work. Others resented its privileges. Tenants might bring grain, wool, fish, rents, complaints, or lawsuits to its officers. The walls separated monks from lay society, but they never fully cut the monastery off from the economy that fed it. Women also belonged in this story, even when surviving records preserve them unevenly. Nunneries followed their own versions of enclosure, discipline, estate management, manuscript use, hospitality, and prayer. Noble women could become patrons, widows could retire near religious houses, and female servants often worked in outer spaces connected to large institutions. A history of medieval monastic life that only imagines men in choir stalls misses part of the social world that made the system possible. The architecture amplified every rule. Thick walls controlled temperature and sound. Narrow stairs guided movement. Screens separated spaces according to rank and ritual purity. Doorways made obedience physical by deciding who could cross and when. Light from high windows could make a church feel otherworldly, but the same complex still needed drains, kitchens, storage rooms, latrines, workshops, stables, and roofs that did not leak during winter rain. When historians describe monasteries as wealthy, that wealth should not be pictured only as treasure. It was stored in land, rights, animals, tools, harvests, rents, mills, fish ponds, books, roofs, and legal privileges. A monastery could be rich in property and still short of ready cash. It could own many acres and still struggle to repair a damaged wall. Medieval wealth was powerful, but it was often slow, local, seasonal, and bound to obligations. Conflict entered through small doors, a missing key, an unpaid rent, an undisciplined novice, a sick cellarer, a forged document, a spoiled harvest, or a rumor about misconduct could disturb the whole community. The rule promised stability, but stability had to be produced again and again by meetings, punishments, negotiations, prayers, repairs, and written records. The calm surface of monastic life was the result of constant maintenance. The same is true of knowledge. Monasteries preserved learning, but they also filtered it. Books were copied because someone valued them, paid for materials, assigned labor, and protected them from damp, theft, fire, and insects. Medical recipes, estate accounts, sermons, saints' lives, legal privileges, and musical notation all survived through institutions that had reasons to keep them. What remains from the Middle Ages is partly a record of what monasteries chose to remember. There were limits to the ideal. Monks could be lazy, proud, frightened, corrupt, generous, brilliant, lonely, or deeply sincere. Abbots could be holy reformers or ambitious managers. Lay brothers could sustain a house and still be treated as socially inferior. Guests could receive charity and still be ranked by status. The monastery preached humility, but it operated in a society obsessed with hierarchy, land, lineage, and visible honor. A medieval book was not simply written. It was grown, skinned, scraped, ruled, copied, painted, corrected, chained, guarded, and feared. That is the key to avoiding both romantic myth and cheap scandal. The monastery was neither a peaceful museum nor a secret dungeon by nature. It was a living medieval institution, capable of beauty, discipline, exploitation, care, bureaucracy, learning, and fear, sometimes in the same week and sometimes in the same room. By the late 14th century, many houses were living with the consequences of plague and demographic shock. Fewer workers meant higher wages outside the cloister and more pressure on estates that depended on customary labor. Recruitment could become harder. Buildings designed for larger communities could feel oversized. Old routines continued, but the people performing them knew that the world beyond the gate had changed in ways no customary could fully solve. That pressure makes the subject more interesting, not less. How medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts shows a society trying to turn belief into durable practice. It reveals how medieval people measured time, controlled bodies, organized labor, stored value, handled danger, and explained suffering. It also shows how much of daily life happened in the gap between an ideal written in Latin and the stubborn realities of mud, hunger, illness, weather, money, and tired hands. If we could stand there for one quiet minute, the scene would not feel like a fantasy version of the Middle Ages. It would smell of smoke, damp wool, wax, bread, herbs, ink, animals, and stone after rain. It would sound like bells, sandals, pages, hinges, water, and low voices. And beneath all of it would be the central rhythm of the monastery, repeated prayer holding together a complicated human machine. The final lesson of how medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts is that medieval monastic life was built from details. No single detail explains the whole institution, but together they show how a religious community tried to survive across generations. Stone gave it shelter, rules gave it shape, land gave it income, memory gave it authority, and daily repetition gave it the feeling of permanence even when the century around it was unstable. Another way to see how medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts is through timekeeping. Medieval people did not experience the day as a neutral sequence of hours. Bells divided attention, and each division carried a duty. In the monastery, time was claimed before the individual could claim it for himself. That made manuscript labor and written memory feel less like an occasional activity and more like a permanent condition, something that shaped memory through repetition. The librarian had to think about the subject in practical terms. Ideals mattered, but someone still had to decide who held the key, who carried the message, who repaired the damage, who paid the worker, who apologized to the patron, and who corrected the mistake. Medieval administration was often slow and personal, but it could be surprisingly exact when property, obedience, or reputation was at stake. Inside the scriptorium, the difference between a rule and a lived experience became obvious. A rule could be written in a few lines, but living it required scraping parchment, ruling pages, mixing pigments, correcting lines, and guarding books. It required patience when the body was tired, clarity when records were confusing, and humility when a younger or lower-ranking person had to do work that kept the whole house alive. There was also a seasonal rhythm. Winter made stone rooms bitter and shortened useful daylight. Spring brought mud, lambing, repairs, and new agricultural calculations. Summer offered long working days, but also heat, flies, and the danger of spoiled food or sickness. Autumn brought rents, harvests, storing, brewing, slaughtering, and accounting. The monastery looked timeless, but its workload changed with the weather. Sound shaped the experience as much as sight. The bell did not merely announce prayer, it controlled movement across the entire enclosure. Footsteps in a cloister could reveal whether a brother was late. A cough in choir could expose weakness. A door latch in the night could become suspicious. Even silence had texture, because a silent community still produced the noises of labor, illness, hunger, and discipline. The danger of fire, damp, theft, and expensive mistakes explains many choices that may seem excessive now. Medieval communities had fewer buffers against breakdown. A lost document could threaten income. A damaged roof could ruin stored grain. A sick official could leave accounts unfinished. A scandal could reduce donations. A failed harvest could turn charity into triage. In that context, strict procedure was not just conservatism, it was a survival tool. The outside world entered through negotiation. Patrons, students, messengers, and stationers did not simply admire the monastery from a distance. They bargained with it, depended on it, complained about it, and sometimes feared it. The gate was therefore more than an entrance. It was the place where enclosed religion met hunger, debt, labor, travel, law, and local memory. Objects carried authority because so much of medieval life depended on physical proof. A sharpened quill could settle a question that no spoken memory could settle. A seal could make an order travel beyond the person who gave it. A written list could outlive the monk who wrote it. A stored tool could preserve a technique. The monastery survived partly by turning trust into objects that could be checked. Modern viewers often look for the most dramatic image, but the deeper story is usually in maintenance. Someone swept the floor before a ceremony. Someone trimmed the lamp. Someone counted loaves, folded cloth, patched a shoe, sharpened a knife, aired a book, cleaned a drain, or carried water. Without that hidden work, the famous rituals of medieval monastic life would have collapsed within days. The evidence from colophons, catalogs, and surviving manuscripts asks for patience. It rarely gives a perfect scene. Instead, it offers a rent payment here, a correction there, a broken wall, a missing servant, a purchase of candles, a note about discipline, or a complaint about behavior. Put together, those fragments reveal a dense human system where holiness was pursued through countless practical decisions. The atmosphere would have been unmistakably physical. ink, scraped skin, candle smoke, dry pigment, and polished wood. The medieval monastery was not clean in a modern clinical sense, but it was ordered according to its own priorities. Some spaces were washed, swept, and guarded with care. Others were smoky, muddy, noisy, or crowded. The contrast between sacred order and bodily reality was part of the experience. That contrast is what gives how medieval monks made illuminated manuscripts its lasting power as a historical subject. It shows people trying to build a disciplined life in a world that kept resisting discipline. Bodies became hungry. Buildings aged. Money ran short. Novices made mistakes. Rulers demanded taxes. Weather ruined plans. And death entered without permission. Still the bell rang. The office began again, and the community tried to continue.